caribou in Alberta are an endangered species, and it's mainly due to human activities, such as cutting seismic lines searching for oil and gas that are causing destruction to their habitat. Today's lesson is on the recycling of matter. So, in the last lesson, we saw the impact that human activities can have on the cycling of matter, primarily deforestation, wildfires, the burning of fossil fuels, as well as industry. Now, the human impact on abiotic factors includes the polluting of water sources, so typically decreasing the quality and quantity of water that's available to the ecosystem. We typically have an over-reliance on fertilizers, which increases the nitrogen compounds in ecosystems and water bodies. We clear cut as a method of logging, which decreases the oxygen available in an atmosphere and increases the CO2. We burn fossil fuels, which decrease the available oxygen and increase this atmospheric carbon dioxide. And the use of CFCs, which has now been banned, which decreases our ozone layer protection and increases our risk of UV radiation. So now we're going to look at how these human impacts, what type of impacts these human activities have on biotic factors. So generally, an ecosystem is considered to be healthy if it's free of pollution, if it doesn't have any vegetation loss, if the water flow is not disrupted, and there's been no new species introduced that are harmful to that ecosystem. Ecosystems also need to be able to and are able to recover from different disturbances. So humans can affect ecosystems by causing stress to that ecosystem or interfering with its ability to recover from stress. So the Three Gorges Dam is a hydroelectric dam that was built in the Yangtze Valley in China. So here is the Three Gorges Dam, and it's huge, and we have dams like this in North America, not quite this big. One's called Site C in British Columbia. And we can see the effect that the Three Gorges Dam had. So our bottom picture was the older picture, older satellite image, and then the top picture is the newer one. So we can see how it created this massive lake and caused kind of upstream flooding on all the tributaries to this river. So now this would have displaced people, plants, and organisms. Another way that humans can affect ecosystems is through the process of habitat fragmentation. So this is the breaking of a continuous habitat into smaller, separate habitats. This can happen by things as simple as creating roads or putting up fences, which will limit the movement of animals. Putting up natural gas pipelines, because it can either create cut lines or create blockages in a path. So like if a pipeline is above the ground, but not high enough up that things like bears cannot get underneath it. Power lines and clear cutting. So these all create straight line disturbances in an animal's habitat. So this could affect habitats and animals if relationships are affected between species because two species might now be physically isolated from one another. And well, cleared areas for clear cutting might help support one species, like birds, songbirds, but it could create a shift in the balance of the ecosystem. So one example of that is the balance of moose and caribou in northern Alberta. So in northern Alberta, lots of boreal forests have been fragmented by roads built by oil and gas companies for exploration. And even if these are just seismic lines, but not roads, but just straight, clear lines cut in the forest. So the ideal habitat for woodland caribou is boreal forest with a lot of snowpack because their feet are large enough that they can walk on top of the snow. But moose tend to thrive in more cleared areas because they like to eat new growing shrubs and plants. So as more roads and seismic lines come in, moose are able to travel through these to increase their population and their distribution. But the increase of prey populations like moose allow the population of wolves to increase. Now, these wolves will prey on not only moose, but caribou, affecting their survival. And caribou are now on the endangered species list. So in Alberta, they've tried several things to increase the caribou population, but it looks like the most successful one is to reduce human impact on environments. And so that's something that they're working on improving in northern Alberta, is to reduce human disturbance in areas where caribou are living. So another alteration that humans do to animal ecosystems is habitat disruption. So this would be the permanent alteration of a habitat. So, clear cutting can be a significant example of habitat destruction, where a forest is removed and the forest that returns is not the same as the one that was there before. Agricultural farming destroys habitats because we drain wetlands, we cut trees, we remove native prairie grasslands, and we plant monoculture crops that aren't there in the winter to maintain any herbivore species. Urbanization is also habitat disruption, where again, we're draining swamps and wetlands, we're cutting down trees, we're removing prairie grasslands to build more houses. And this is the leading cause of species endangerment and extinction. When we look at species endangerment, there's five main categories for species whose survivals are at risk, depending on how vulnerable they are to extinction. So this could be vulnerable all the way through to threatened, endangered, and extinct. So a vulnerable species is likely to become threatened in the future. For example, wolverine. So wolverines have very specific habitats in northern Alberta, but because they're not as populated, they're not currently at the highest risk of extinction. Then we have threatened species, which are likely to become endangered if current factors aren't reversed. So the peregrine falcon. Now, these birds became endangered when humans were using a chemical that, as it built through the food chain, affected their ability to successfully lay eggs. But because peregrine falcons also are successfully adapting to living in more urban environments, their populations have rebounded. Now, an endangered species is threatened through imminent extinction throughout the area of their where they live. And for example, woodland caribou in northern Alberta and northern BC are threatened by oil and gas exploration and human road development. And unless factors change, this is an imminent and important threat. Their numbers are dropping every year. An extirpated species is a species that still exists in the world but no longer exists in a certain area, such as the black-footed ferret. Now, at one point, scientists thought the black-footed ferret was extirpated in the wild, but then one time, scientists found a small population. Now, they were able to take that population into captivity, breed them, and then release them back into a few areas where they had previously lived. That was successful for a while. Then they all ended up catching their prey species ended up dying of a disease that spread through the population. So the black-footed ferret population in the wild did drop again. But they still have captive populations that they help boost those wild populations with for when they breed and release them. Then an extinct species is one that no longer exists anywhere in the world, whether this is in captivity or in the wild. So the Banff long-nosed dace was a species that was only found in Banff National Park in a marsh into which the Cave and Basin hot springs drain because there was a warmer water there than anywhere else. And there's no estimate as to the past size of this population, but it was killed off by the introduction of tropical fishes, from leakage of chlorine into the marsh, and from the construction of a beaver dam. So there's no way that we can return this population to the wild. It is gone from Earth. Some other extinct species include the Tasmanian tiger, which went extinct in the early 20th century, and the dodo bird. Well, there have been several mass extinctions throughout the world, and the most massive one was the extinction at the end of the Cambrian period, because that's when there was the most booming biodiversity on Earth. And since the Industrial Revolution began in about the 1700s, roughly 10 to 20% of the Earth's species have become extinct. And if the current extinction rates continue, we could see a loss of about 50% of our biodiversity by 2100, which means about half of the Earth's species will be extinct, which will then be considered a mass extinction. And this has only really happened 5 or 6 times in the Earth's history and have previously been due to natural phenomena, such as meteors colliding with Earth or ice ages. So this is a pretty serious situation that the diversity of the Earth finds itself in. So biodiversity is the variety of ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity in an area. So an ecosystem with more species and genetic diversity is more able to cope and change because there's variation within the population. So we might have animals that are more likely to survive in plants in drought periods, and then other plants in damp periods. So no matter what the environment would be, there would always be plants there. But as certain species become extinct or genetically limited, that diversity is lost and the entire ecosystem is affected. One domestic example is the loss of diversity in golden retrievers or Labrador retrievers. So, due to very selective breeding practices, the gene pool of labs has been cut down, and now they're more susceptible to hip problems and other diseases, typically genetic diseases. Now, the average life expectancy of a lab has dropped from 15 years a couple decades ago to only 10 to 12 years now, which is a lot for it's like a third of its lifespan is now gone. That would be like humans' lifespan dropping to 60 years from the just under, well, it's 85 now, but if we were just imagining it at 90 for early math, that's like a dog going down to, or a human going down to life expectancy of only 60 years. So invasive species are another threat to an ecosystem. And this um, invasive species usually travel on animals or cargo ships, or humans or cargo ships, or human um, equipment like boats. So this is when a new species is introduced into an ecosystem, and that species typically will thrive because it's a generalist and expand in population rapidly. And it takes over and threatens the area's biodiversity. So two that are very important in Alberta are the zebra mussel and purple loosestrife. So the zebra mussel you might have heard about if you've ever boated anywhere, because often at boat launches they have signs that say drain, dry, and clean your boat. So they want you to make sure no water or plant material or animal material goes from one water body to another, because the zebra mussel grows rapidly. It can clog intake pipes. It grows on um, piers, and it outcompetes other animals that are native to Alberta for food and location, and it's not readily eaten by Alberta's species. So new species introduced by humans can be unintentional. So, like I said, a few members of a species or some spores stowed on a ship traveling to another part of a world. They can travel in vehicles, shipping containers, luggage, and agricultural produce, which is why you're not allowed to bring produce or soil from other countries when you come back into Canada. Often, produce sent between countries is treated to prevent any agricultural pests from coming along, and it's also inspected at the point of departure and the point of arrival. Sometimes introduction of invasive species is intentional to expand biodiversity, so to give a lake or pond, for example, new food options. Occasionally, this has been done for biological control, where governments introduce new species to control other damaging species, but it doesn't always happen well. So one example of this was in Canada, we have a small insect called a weevil, which destroys canola and other crops. And to combat weevils, two species of wasps were introduced, one which attacks weevils that are adults, and the other attacks weevils as larvae. Both wasps are parasitic, um, but they do not sting humans. So they're able to destroy the weevils without affecting humans. And this successfully suppressed the weevil population in Europe, but has not worked in North America. In Australia, they had a really disastrous attempt at biological control to control a population of beetles that were destroying the sugarcane crops. And these beetles, incidentally, were also invasive. So the Australian government purchased cane toads from Hawaii, which they believed would eat the beetles that were growing in the sugarcane. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough research being done, and the cane toads didn't often come in contact with these beetles. And then the cane toads were poisonous, posing a danger to children, pets, and wild animals. So if your pet eats this cane toad, it probably will die. And there are no predators in Australia that feed on these poisonous toads, and so now they're considered a pest, far more serious than the original beetle population. So a native species is one that was found naturally in an ecosystem, and an invasive species is one that was introduced afterwards. So the introduction of a new species can threaten the survival of a native species because it could directly kill that native species. It can compete with the native species for food and space, like the zebra mussel, or it could spread disease and parasites to native species. Typically, those invasive species are able to survive because they have limited threats of being preyed upon. They're typically very efficient at reproducing, and they're known as generalists. So they can live in a lot of areas with a lot of different habitats. So one thing that we always need to balance is our economy versus our ecology. So our economic system relies on employment. It allows us with a means to buy goods and services. However, our ecological system provides us with clean air, clean water, and food. So, one thing that ecologists attempt to do often is monetize our ecological system. So, they'll place a value on what one tree means to the environment or one wetland. And this is a way that we can more easily balance our economic needs with our ecological needs. So, it's not about, well, if we drain this swamp, we can grow more canola. It says, well, what monetary value does that swamp add to the ecosystem? How does it help keep our groundwater clean, which means we have cleaner drinking water, which keeps us safer? So, even though humans rely on both systems, the goals of the two systems are often in opposition, and we're always looking for ways to balance them. So, ecosystems take thousands of millions of years to become established and balanced. And when we disrupt them, they can take a long time to go back into that balance. But businesses are able to make changes on a much more quick basis. So, if we drain a wetland, it's not like we can just put that wetland back. So, it's important to look at all the different aspects of, say, draining that wetland. Ecosystems are also inextricably tied to their physical environment. So you can't just pick that wetland up and move it somewhere else. We can't take the black loam soil in the Edmonton area and move it to other parts of Alberta where people don't want to, where we're not having urban sprawl, but we're still relying on farming, and take that excellent farming quality soil and move it to another part of the province. Where for a business, physical surroundings aren't as important. So you're looking for an area where it's easy to work. But that physical environment is important to our ecosystems. An ecosystem is considered successful if it shows stability and balance, where businesses are usually successful if they show profit. So, when an ecosystem wants to rely on balance, a business wants to have profit and growth, which unfortunately often comes at the expense of ecosystems or other businesses. So, this is something that humans have been struggling with and we are continue to struggle with as we move forward in today's economy. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. See you next time.